use Blender's Filmic profiles in Affinity Photo. Boom! Hey guys and gals, Danny here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up Affinity Photo's color management with Blender's Filmic profiles. Alright, before we jump into this, first and foremost, a quick shout out to all the new subscribers. Welcome aboard. Thank you very much for your support. To all my awesome existing subscribers, big thanks to all you as well for sticking in there with me. All of you guys help make the videos possible. You help keep me motivated. I can't express how much I appreciate it, so thank you. All right, let's do this. So here we are in Affinity Photo, but before we start going crazy with Blender Filmic and our EXR files, we need to set up color management. This is not done by default in Affinity Photo. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up our color management to tell Affinity Photo how to handle our files when we bring them into Affinity. So we're going to tell Affinity Photo what to do with, say, EXR files when we bring them in. Now, we're not limited to Blender Filmic either. We can set up color management in Affinity Photo to use ACES, for example, or any other color management system. We just have to set it up before we use it. Since I'm using Blender as my 3D application and the source for much of my compositing layers, it makes sense to use Blender's Filmic profiles, but you can set up whatever works best for you. So here's what we need to do. First, we need to locate our Blender OCIO files. Now this will slightly vary depending on whether you're a Mac or a PC, for the beginning part anyway. But after that, it's pretty much the same thing. So first thing we're going to do, if you're on the Mac, you're just going to go to your Finder, Applications, find your Blender version that you want to use, and then you're going to right click on the icon and you're going to say Show Package Contents. Now on the PC, you're going to go into your program files, you're going to go into your Blender Foundation folder, find the version of Blender that you want to use, and then drill into that. And from that point on, you're pretty much at the same place. All right. Now, once you're in that file, that Blender folder, you want to drill into that contents folder, then drill into resources, and then the version of Blender that you're using. Okay, so in my case, you see Blender 3.1. Okay, now you would click into there, and you're going to see a folder called Data Files. So go into Data Files, and then you see a folder called Color Management. This is our destination. That's what we want. So if you open up Color Management, you're going to see these three items. You're going to see a config.ocio, a Filmic folder, and a LUTs folder. Now what you want to do is take all three of these elements and copy them somewhere else on your computer. I'm on a Mac. For me, it makes sense. I just copied them over to my Documents folder. You do whatever works best for you. Just don't forget where they are and don't put them in a place where they might be thrown away. Okay, so there is one caveat here, and that is in Blender 3.0 and up, Blender is using the new version of OCIO, so OCIO 2. But the newest version of Blender are newer than the latest version of Affinity Photo, and Affinity Photo is still using the previous version of OCIO. That means the config file and these LUTs from Blender 3 and up will not work in Affinity Photo. You do the same thing, you get the same files, and you move them to the same place. However, you have to use an older version of Blender, say 2.93. Now, you might not have an older version of Blender installed on your system, so I will include a link in the description to a file which will contain these three assets for you. Okay, so just grab them if you don't already have them and just put them in whatever, safe space on your computer you have to get them. Now that we've taken those files and we've isolated them, I'm not going to do it here because I've already done it. We need to install those color management systems, profile, whatever you want to call it, into Affinity Photo. On the Mac and the PC here, this is essentially the same thing. You're going to go into your preferences. On the Mac, it's under the Affinity Photo tab. On Windows, it's going to be under your Edit tab. But you're going to go into your preferences, and you should look at a screen like this, right? That has all your kind of 30,000 foot view of your available preferences. Now what you're going to do is go into Color. Now when you go into Color, we're going to talk about a few different options here. But the first thing we want to do is look down here. It's about the middle of the way through, and you're going to see this Open Color Configuration file, or rather Open Color IO configuration file. Hit the Select button, and it's going to ask you where that config.ocio file is. That's the file that you just copied over to a safe place on your computer. So in my case, I've already done it, but I'll hit select. I'll go to my documents folder. And in my case, I made a folder called 2.93 color. And then there it is. There's my config.ocio and my folders of LUTs. So I would select this config.ocio and hit open. I'm not going to do it because it's already here. Now for the Mac users, there's one extra step you have to do. And this is for Apple security things. You're going to see an additional option here that says OpenColorIO search folder. Click on select and it's going to bring you to the root directory where your config OCIO is and your Filmic LUTs folders. If it doesn't, just navigate to the same directory where they are and hit OK. And that's going to add that search folder to that directory. Windows users, you don't have to do that. Now that that's done, there's one other thing I want to comment on really quick, and that's up here at your color space profiles. Now these are settings that you set that Affinity Photo will then run with every time you open up an image. So for example, we see RGB color profile is currently set. This is default, sRGB, right? 32-bit color profile, sRGB linear, and then you have your CMYK, grayscale, lab, etc. You can set these to whatever you want. So if you'd rather work in Adobe RGB or I think there's everything you can think of right here, Pro Photo, etc. You can set that here. And what will happen is every time you open a file in Affinity Photo, if it's an RGB file, it'll automatically set its space to whatever you set here. So Adobe RGB, sRGB, Pro Photo, whatever you want. Same thing with the 32-bit file. Every time you open a 32-bit file, it'll do the same thing. It'll set it to, right now by default, it's sRGB linear, but you can set it to Adobe RGB linear. It's really up to you. For now, I'm going to keep it as the default sRGB just for consistency from start to finish, but you can set that up however you want. Okay, so once that's done, hit close. Okay, and it's going to ask you to restart Affinity Photo. So go ahead, restart Affinity Photo, and when it comes back, we'll go ahead and get to work. So here we are, Affinity Photo is reopened, and if we set everything up correctly, we should now have color management in place where Affinity Photo will recognize files that we open and process them according to what the preferences that we set up. So let's give it a shot. We're going to go to Open, and I'm going to open that EXR file that I rendered out of Blender. Now, if you'd like to follow along with this exact image, I'll put a link in the description where you can grab it. If not, and you'd like to use your own EXR image, cool. Just get an OpenEXR 32-bit render out of Blender and open it up in Affinity Photo, and you're good to go. So we've opened our image. What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a couple things. One, we're looking at a linear image, which we'll talk about in a second. The other thing we see here is a little dialog that says, Affinity Photo converted this document from sRGB to scene linear, and that just says it did what we told it to do. It took our non-color managed linear file, and when we opened it, it said, oh, okay, you need to be sRGB linear, which is what we set in our preferences. That's all that is. What we actually see now is a non-color managed linear version of our file. Now, in Blender, if you rendered this out as, say, a TIFF or a PNG, you wouldn't see this. You would see whatever filmic settings you set applied to that image. And in other words, in those file formats where color management is applied, you would see exactly that. You would see that image with color management applied. However, when we bring that linear file, that 32-bit OpenEXR file into Affinity Photo, we're seeing it true to its nature. We're seeing a linear, non-color managed file. Okay, so what do we do with this? How do we apply Blender's Filmic profiles to this image? The first thing we should do anytime we work with a 32-bit EXR file is open up our 32-bit preview. So go to View, Studio, 32-bit preview. Now this dialog box may have opened up somewhere in your panels here. I keep mine up here, so that's just where it opens by default. But you want to find it. It might be next to your channels. Just drag it out here so you can see it. Okay. We're not going to really mess with any of these settings here. We're going to leave exposure and gamma alone. I will talk a little bit about the show EDR clipping, but our focus right now is in the display transforms. By default, Affinity Photo will automatically set up standard none as the OCIO display transform. This is because Blender actually has this as an option. when you render out a Filmic EXR file. We don't want this. In fact, we don't want any of the OCIO display transforms. We want to use an ICC display transform. So we're going to ignore this. Select an ICC display transform, and it's going to change our image. And essentially what it's trying to do is display the image with our ICC display transform. Basically, it's trying to tell us this is what it should look like on your screen instead of the linear file you were looking at. But this isn't Filmic, and this is not actually tone mapped or anything like that. That's the next part of the process. But you have to start here. This is our starting point. Okay. Now, just for what it's worth, if I did click on Show EDR Clipping, you'll see here it shows us where our highlights have been clipped. They're essentially overexposed, right? Now you can leave that on or leave that off. I'm going to leave it off for now, but just that's an option for you. Okay. So how do we get Blender's Filmic profile now applied to this? Well, it's a 3-step process. It's really not hard. We're going to use adjustment layers. Okay. Let me just jump into my layers panel and get rid of this non-essential layer. Okay. Here we are. Let's get started. So the first step in our process is to add 3 adjustment layers. And those adjustment layers can be accessed a couple different ways. You can go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and in this case we want OCIO as our first one. When that opens up, it's going to ask us for 2 things. It wants a source color space and a destination color space. So for our source, we're going to say linear. For our destination, we're going to scroll down here and choose Filmic Log. Now note something. If you didn't set up your color management properly, you will not see these Filmic options. They won't be here. If you did set it up properly, you'll have these available to you. Okay. So Filmic Log is what we want. And then there we go. And essentially what that's done is it's taken our linear space and it's converted it to log space. That's the first step in building the Filmic look in Affinity Photo. The next thing we need to do is add a LUT. So we're going to go back to our adjustments, but this time I'm going to use the adjustments button right here in our layers panel. And I'm going to scroll down to LUT. And I'm going to choose Load LUT. Now remember those 3 items we copied over earlier? Well, we're going to navigate to that folder. So in my case, Documents 2.93 color. And then here I have my 3 items that I copied over. What I want to do is go into the Filmic folder. And these 1D files here are all LUTs. These are all Filmic LUTs that represent contrast. So in Blender, you may have noticed this, when you're choosing to work with Filmic, you have options for contrast that you can choose, or you can just choose none, right? But you can pick various options from the least amount of contrast to the most contrast. Well, that's exactly what these are. They just don't say that. And it is a bit confusing. But if you look at this, and you look at this the way I have it organized now, these numbers here, focus on these numbers here, 35, 48, 60, 70, 85, 99, and 120, even though it says 1.20. I don't understand the naming convention here. If somebody wants to explain this to me, that'd be great. To me, it doesn't make any sense. But just know that these numbers correlate to the amount of contrast in the LUT. So 35 being the least, 120 being the most. So pick the level of contrast that makes sense for you. I'm going to choose the most contrast right now. This can always be changed later. Hit open. And you can see what it's done. Okay, and now applied that Filmic contrast LUT to our log space image. So if I turn it off, turn it on, we can see what it did. The last thing we need to do in the process is add another OCIO adjustment layer. And in this time, we're going to set our source to sRGB and our destination to linear. And we're done. So there's the entire process, right? We essentially round tripped it. We went from linear to log, we applied a Filmic contrast LUT, and then went back to linear. Okay, so we're still working with a 32-bit linear file, but now we have Filmic applied to it. If I go back up here and I click on Show EDR Clipping again, see how nothing is clipping? Okay. Everything has been set exactly where it needs to go. Something to note, when you're working with a single layer file, like we are here, you don't have to use Filmic. If you would rather tone map your image yourself, you could absolutely do that. You could not bother with any of this. You can stay with your linear file as we started with, and then you can use Affinity Photo's tone mapping When you're working with multiple layers, let's say you have a composite that you're going to work on and it's 3, 5, or 15 layers, and they all need to be tone mapped the same way. If you're using Affinity Photo's tone mapping persona, you have to do that to every single layer. That takes considerable time, and you run the risk of not being consistent through all of your layers. Whereas if you're using Filmic, which makes sense if you're using Blender, then you can apply those same 3 adjustment layers to your entire composite at once. So you're consistent from start to finish. Just a little bit easier way of thinking about it. And I'll show this more in depth when I get into actual compositing videos. Okay, so before I end this thing, I want to show you guys something. If you don't want to take the time to make those adjustment layers every single time you do this, you don't need to. We can set up a macro. If you're not familiar, a macro is akin to actions in Photoshop. I will say that actions in Photoshop are way more advanced than macros in Affinity Photo. However, macros in Affinity Photo can be very effective, very useful, and I actually use them quite often for all kinds of things that I'll talk about in future videos. But for now, let's go ahead and record a macro that will apply our Blender Filmic profile to our image. Okay, so the first thing you want to do, if you don't already have the dialog open, is go to View, Studio, and Macro. Now mine has a check mark next to it because I already have it open, but that's what you're going to do. Okay, and that's going to bring up your macro dialog box here, your macro panel. With your macro panel open, just like Photoshop Actions, you want to start recording. So you have a little red button here, that's your record button. Once I hit this, everything I do is going to be recorded. So I'll start by hitting record. First thing I want to do is I want to create a group. So the way we do that here is we go to Layer, New Group. I'm going to give this group a name. I'm going to call it Blender Filmic. Okay. Now you could make a macro for every single contrast level you have access to. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to make one, but you do have the ability to do that if you wish. Okay. With that still selected, I want to add my first adjustment layer. So just like before, if you wanted to, you would go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, scroll down to OCIO, and then choose your source and destination. So again, it's going to go from linear to Filmic log, and there we go. While that adjustment layer is still selected, we need to move it into the Blender Filmic group. So go to Arrange, Move Inside. That's how you're going to move an adjustment layer into a group while you're recording a macro. Okay, once you're here, select your second one. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to add my LUT. Just like before, I'm going to go to my LUTs, and this time I'm going to choose kind of a mid-contrast LUT and hit OK. And then lastly, apply our final OCIO, which is going to take us from sRGB to linear. And we're done. Okay. Lastly, while we're still recording, select your group layer. Make sure this says Select Parent Layer. Hit Select. Collapse the window. Stop the recording. Okay. Our macro is done. To test it, let's just get rid of this. And we can just come over here and hit the play button. And if we did this right, there it is. There's our group with all of our adjustment layers, and we're done. Next thing to do is save your macro. Click on this little icon here that looks like a grid. It says Add to Library. This dialog is going to open up and it's going to ask you what category you want to save it to. If you've not set up your own categories, default's going to be your only option. But you can set up your own. In this case, I do have my own here, and I already have this saved. So if I didn't, I would choose the directory I wanted to go to or the category I wanted to go to, give it a name, say Blender Filmic, and hit OK. And what that means is I can go in here and just remove this macro at this point. If I look in my library, I can see there's the one that I made before. And this one I specified, Blender Filmic Medium Contrast, but it's the same thing. Okay. If I get rid of this here, pretend I have a brand new file just opened up into Affinity Photo. And the first thing I want to do is apply my Filmic profile. I can just go into my library. And if you don't already have it open, it's View, Studio, Library. Okay. And just click on my macro, and then there it is. It's done. Okay. That's it. Now, as I said, you can make a macro for every level of contrast that you want, if you want to do that. For this demo, I didn't do that. I just made one because it's easy enough just to go into your adjustment layer and change the LUT whenever you want. So let's say I chose this one, but I look at it and I say, you know what? It's not enough contrast for me for this particular image. So I'm going to go into my LUT, load LUT, and I'm just going to choose a different one. Say something I want, is more contrast. I'll just choose the higher level contrast and I'm done. That's all I have to do. It's really that simple. It's non-destructive. Can change this whenever I want, can turn it off whenever I want. That's it. We're done. We applied a macro, we made a macro that now applies our filmic profile whenever we need it. Fast, easy, done. So that's it. That's how we apply Blender Filmic to our OpenEXR linear file in Affinity Photo. I hope this was useful. If you like the videos I'm making, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Give me a thumbs up. Leave me a comment. Let me know if there's something specific you want me to talk about. Or let me know something I'm doing wrong. I am in no way, shape, or form an expert in color management. I know what I know from watching others and reading documents and etc. And I'm trying to make it easy for other people to get into it. But if you know a better way, let me know. I can stand to learn some new stuff and I'm always looking to improve. So let me know in the comments if I could be doing something that's actually better than what I've shown you here. Again, to all my subscribers, both new and existing, I really appreciate you. Thank you very much. Your following helps motivate me to keep making videos like this. So that's all I've got for this video. There are more coming. We're going to get into actual compositing fairly soon here. We're going to be using Blender, stock images, custom photography, all kinds of things. But I wanted you guys to have an idea of how I work when I'm working with OpenEXR files. This was my attempt to help get you guys up to speed so we can talk about how I do my actual compositing, and we'll get into that. All right, guys, be civil to one another, make cool shit. I'll see you in the next one.